Hi, thank you so much for tuning in. And I have Anthony Lewis and Charles Obert today with me. And we are going to talk about a very interesting subject today, which is blending modern and traditional astrology. We're just thinking like how to talk about blending modern and traditional astrology, but we'll just go on where the flow takes us. At the end of the day, we are going to talk about both modern and traditional astrology. Thanks, Anthony and Charlie, for joining me. It's an honor to have you both on the same forum.
Well, thank you for inviting us.
Indeed, it's a pleasure to be here with both of you gentlemen.
Thank you. So both of you have been doing astrology for a long time, at least 20 years. And the thing is, we already discussed it offline. So both of you started with modern Western astrology or psychological astrology, or some form of Western astrology that has a lot of psychological orientation in its approach, and then switched to traditional astrology. But it is not necessary that you would kind of call yourself completely divorced from modern psychological astrology and you became traditional astrologers. I'm sure both of you are still pretty much using some of the modern astrological concepts. For example, Anthony still uses Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. He likes to use Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto even in horary astrology, because I've done some work with you in horary astrology. So, and most of your articles also contain various inferences to the outer planets. And Charlie, I think you have written a book which is Introduction to Traditional Natal Astrology, which is kind of basically a beginner's workbook to the modern astrologers, which opens the gate for them to get into the traditional astrology zone. And it is one of the most important books for people to kind of get into traditional astrology, because I think it is actually designed for students, right?
Yes, and it's exactly that getting into traditional astrology can be really daunting. It's a really, really complicated subject. So what I ended up writing there was, after years and years of going through these traditional texts, this is the book I wish I'd had when I got started. Oh. This is the bridge concepts. This is how to organize getting started with traditional. And I feel good about it. I've gotten some pretty good feedback about it there.
Great, sure. So Anthony, let's hear your story first. What was your first turn to traditional astrology, and when did it happen?
It probably happened in my late teens or early 20s. And I was born in 1945, so I think I'm a little older than Charlie. And I first got interested in astrology when I was 11. And the interest...
It's very young.
Young, yeah. So, and I'm 70, I'll be 74 this year. So that's how many years? I can't subtract that big. 63 years of
wow.
interest in astrology. And I mean, the way it started was when I was 11, my family went to an amusement park in Rye, New York. I don't know if you know it. And they had this machine where you put in a nickel or a dime and you get a scroll with your horoscope. So my father bought his, and I read it on the way home. And he had Sun in Gemini, and I read this description of him, and it seemed so accurate. I thought he was playing a joke on me. I thought he must have somehow printed up this scroll and substituted it, because it really described him perfectly. And then I realized, no, this was like a copyrighted thing, and he couldn't have done it. And that got me really curious. Like, how could this machine know so much about my father just based on his birth date? So I went to the library, and in those days, this would have been 1956, sort of Elvis Presley time. So he was starting, and there was very little available in the library about astrology, at least in my hometown.
Okay.
And the only books I could find there were a couple by Evangeline Adams, which I've read, and there were a couple by, oh God, I forgot the guy's name. Doesn't matter. And so that was my introduction to astrology. And and I got hold of Horoscope magazine. Do you know it? I think it's still around. And they had really interesting articles. And so I began doing charts. I was really interested in the sciences. So I got some instructions on how to set up an astrological chart. I was using logarithms and my slide rule and trigonometry, which I think astrologers these days don't do anymore, right?
Yeah.
They just use their, but it really makes a difference if you do the chart by hand and put it together piece by piece, because you really get a feel for how the chart is integrated, which you don't get on a computer. And what interested me most was the predictive aspect. I thought, if this could say so much about my father, how is that possible? It doesn't make any sense. I couldn't think of any scientific reason. And so I began doing charts for my friends and family. And what I would do is I would basically look mostly at transits and progressions and then make predictions in writing and give them to them. And then 6 months or a year later, check with them and see what happened. And so I had this very empirical approach.
Okay.
But it was very not psychological. It was much more prediction oriented.
Okay.
And because the psychological stuff I thought was interesting, but I thought it was so general, it could probably apply to almost anybody.
Mm-hmm.
Like, sometimes you get jealous of your friends. Well, who doesn't? So I was really always skeptical of the psychological approach. Although I think it has some value, I don't think it's as precise as the more predictive approach. And then in Horoscope magazine, this was my mid to late teens, probably my senior year of high school, I remember there was an ad. There was an astrologer in Brooklyn. You're from where, Charlie? From Brooklyn?
Yeah, Ridgewood. It's
Ridgewood,
Queens,
okay.
on the border between Brooklyn and Queens.
Yeah.
If you know the subway, the Canarsie line.
Yeah, okay. So I read this ad in Horoscope magazine. An astrologer in Brooklyn said, I'm teaching a horary class and I need questions for my class. And if you send in a question, we'll answer it and send you a response for participating. So my question was, I was a senior in high school. I was applying for a scholarship. And my question is, will I get this scholarship or not to go to college? So I sent this question in, and a month or two later, I get something in the mail, a letter in the mail, and there's my question, and it just says no. No explanation. And that turned out to be right. I didn't get the scholarship. So I thought, well, they had a 50-50 chance of getting this right, but they got it right, so maybe there's something to it. And then, so I didn't believe horary astrology could work. It seemed too fantastical. Like, how could you ask a question, do a chart for the moment you ask a question, and get a valid answer? That made no sense to me. And then a couple years later, I was in a bookstore, and I found this book by William Lilly. It was the Zadkiel abbreviated text, the Dover publication. So I bought it, and I read it, and it made absolutely no sense.
Oh.
I couldn't understand what the hell he was talking about. And I tried a couple charts, and I tried using his rules, and I had no idea what I was doing. So I gave up on horary. And then it wasn't until several years later that I think I attended a lecture on horary by Gilbert Navarro. I don't know if he's still around. Do you know him? He was a student of Ivy Jacobson.
Oh, okay.
And he talked a lot about his experience with Ivy Jacobson. I never met her, but he worked with her. She was his teacher. And she wrote a very famous book on horary. She was living out in, I think, California, in that area. And his stories were remarkable. She was so precise that, he said, for instance, when he first saw her, she asked for his birth date, and he gave the birth data that he remembered. He wasn't sure of the hour. And she looked at it, she said, you couldn't possibly have been born at this time. Yeah, it makes no
Oh,
sense. Go check. And he checked, and sure enough, his hour was wrong, and he found out the correct hour. And then she made some very specific predictions or said some very specific things about him, which turned out to be true. And she was, by all accounts, everyone I know who's worked with her and met her, she's dead now, was quite impressed with how precise she was. And so I read her book, and it was very impressive, and I tried her techniques, and they seemed to work. But she was a modern horary person. I think she had studied Lily, but she really incorporated modern astrology, the outer planets, the rulerships of the outer planets. And so I got interested in horary in the early, I'd say late 70s, early 80s, began doing it. And I attended a workshop by Joan McEvers. Do you know her? She was a wonderful teacher, and she was a very modern horary astrologer too, and very good at it. And she studied Ivy Jacobson. She also studied Lily. And she and I, after that, began a correspondence sharing charts together. So I got into horary that way. And then finally, I think in the mid-'80s, the Regulus edition came out of Lily's unabridged work. And I got hold of that and read it and read it and read it. And it made a little more sense than the original and began practicing. And then when horary works, it's really quite impressive. I mean, you can say to somebody, on this date, this will happen, and that's what happens. And to me, that's astounding, although it's not always that accurate. But when it's accurate, it's astoundingly accurate. And so that's how, am I answering your question? I'm sort of rambling here. I forgot how I was, what I'm supposed to be saying.
No, I think you had a pretty much predictive approach towards astrology, but you're also a psychiatrist on the other hand, right? So you always appreciated the psychological insights that astrology could provide. For example, you knew how your father could actually react mentally on a specific, on a given situation with Sun in Gemini. So you also had this psychological insight, and which is kind of simultaneous, and it kind of complements your predictive nature of doing astrology.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, in terms of the psychological aspects of astrology, what impressed me about psychological astrology is the symbolism. And interpreting a chart from a psychological perspective is very much like what Freud and Jung did in their psychoanalysis. They would take the dream symbols and get their clients' associations to the dream symbols, match them to things in the client's life and what conflicts they had psychologically, and make a story out of it. And so I came to view psychological astrology as dream interpretation, basically, as a psychoanalytic dream interpretation, because basically it's the same process.
Okay. So it was almost a mini autobiography. So let's hear from Charlie as to how he got into traditional astrology and stuff. So
sure, okay, yeah. And actually, when I started out, I was basically modern astrologer. I first began getting heavily into astrology back in the 1980s, and the books that I was trained with. You mentioned one of the astrologers, Tony, the March McEvers series, The Only Way to Learn Astrology. That's what I cut my teeth on. So
had you met them? Did you ever?
No. No, this was all, I live in flyover land.
Yeah, okay.
Minneapolis. I was in a astrology study group at a little local bookstore here called, I think it was Even Star Bookstore. Learned from a teacher there. So psychological modern astrology was the only one I knew. And found it really interesting, and it worked, but it worked up to a point. And where I began to get increasingly interested in traditional astrology is partly, and I think you pointed to this, Tony, what you could call the vagueness of modern astrology. Because, yeah, the dream interpretation metaphor is a pretty good one. You're dealing with symbols. It's very fluid. There's nothing concrete about it. You can't do dream interpretation, do prediction. There's no markers.
Right.
And the other part of modern astrology that I increasingly found limiting was I guess I'd call it the mania to interpret everything positively. And life is just not all positive.
Right.
And the period where I really, really began to get intensely interested in traditional astrology was a very, very difficult period of my life. It was in the middle 2000s when I was dealing with my wife being diagnosed with cancer and going through a couple years of treatment and eventually dying. Well, modern astrology had nothing for me. Couldn't make sense of that, you know? But traditional astrology, looking for the rules, looking for the techniques, looking for a way. And I remember the day, this was working with the primary directions, by the way. But I remember looking at one time and looking that right around the time when she had died, I had primary direction Saturn dead on my descendant.
Yeah.
And when I saw that, I cried. It's like, this makes sense. And I'm very, very fortunate. And by the way, my path into traditional astrology was partially, I got into Lily quite a bit later than you did. I've got the Astro America edition, the one that Dave Rawl did. The recent one. And I'm also very fortunate to live here in Minneapolis. So I'm just a little bit of a ways away from Ben Dykes. And I was watching that, watching that incredible series of translations that he did. And I would read through those translations and not make head or tail of them, and then read through them again, and read through them again, and read through them again, then started seeing the patterns. And talking about traditional and modern, I think part of what creates the communication gap between the two I kind of get tired of the sniping. They're doing very different things. I guess kind of summarizing, traditionally is doing what? It's predictive, you know? Modern is doing why. It's concerned with, what does this mean to you? What's the value of this to? What's the significance of it for you? That's a whole different set of questions. And it's a set of questions that typically is not addressed in traditional. So if you look at them as doing two very different complementary kinds of things, I think you've got something very, very powerful there. I guess I started in modern, went back between hardcore traditional, and then rediscovered modern as a traditional astrologer. And then I could see what it uniquely had to offer. It indeed has its limitations, but it was indeed doing things that I did not see traditional astrology doing. So now I need both. The readings that I do now in client sessions, as much of the session is about not just what's going to happen, but what does this mean to me now? What's the significance to this? How do I make sense of this in my life? And that's a very modern set of questions to be asking. So I do modern astrology with a traditional astrologer's toolkit. The way I think of it.
So that's already a blend of modern and traditional astrology. So
yes.
And it's very interesting to see both of you, how you got into traditional astrology or predictive astrology as it is. But I think we already touched upon this topic in terms of approach towards astrology, whether it is fatalistic or it is free will oriented approach. So if we go back in times, let's say early Hellenistic period, there was a lot of influence of the then Greek philosophy that had a lot of impact or influence on the astrology that was being developed, and it later flourished for 700 or 800 years. So it is, an ancient astrology is always labeled as fatalistic or kind of limits your free will. So I mean, I don't know if limiting free will is the right word, because if someone who doesn't have a traditional astrology background, if he goes and reads some of the descriptions given by Valence for Saturn, he would never go back to traditional astrology, as Charlie rightly pointed out. So modern astrology has always found out ways to see things always with a positive outlook, while there are some things that are explicitly negative, and sometimes traditional astrology looks too negative, especially if you read the descriptions for Saturn's or Mars's bounds in Aries. So that's that's something we really don't want to get into as a modern astrologer. But realistically speaking, Saturn's bounds in Aries means what it is, and if it means negative, it means negative. So there is no change to it. Obviously, it has to give a lot of difficulties, and there is no changing to that. And do you think there is a lot of Stoic influence? I'm not sure. I'm not explicitly exposed to Stoicism, but I've read some works, especially that came out from Stoicism, such as Meditations. But but I really wanted to know from you, Charlie, like if it is really fatalistic or deterministic, or it actually kind of feels a lot of things are divination, and it is not necessarily fatalistic. Divination cannot be necessarily fatalistic. Do you agree with that, or do you have some other ideology in terms of approaching?
Okay, well, I'm going to start with addressing the Stoicism thing. Is there a strong Stoic streak to a lot of the early philosophy? Absolutely. Like, I think you can make a case that the text that comes to mind is Firmicus Maternus, Mathesis. He's very Stoic. He's very, very deterministic. And it's kind of a continuum, that there are some aspects of the traditional astrology that are indeed extremely fatalistic, but you definitely, even where there is an element of free will, it's a free will within constraints. In the modern astrology, you've got very much the opposite of that, what I'm tempted to call a totally unconstrained free will, where this chart is potential, it's yours to do with what you wish, it's all free will. In some ways that's empowering, but in some ways that can be also dreadfully limiting and dreadfully difficult when things go wrong. Because if it's all free will and it's all your choice, and then things go wrong, it must be your fault. It must be you chose wrong. You're choosing this. And I have had, clients where part of the purpose of the session is, listen, this isn't your fault. Things happen to you. So my own take on the whole fatalism and free will kind of a thing, I tend more towards the Stoic side. And by the way, I adore the Stoics. Marcus Aurelius and Seneca, they're two of my Bibles. I just have total admiration for those men. But within that, there's a level, it's a funny way to put it. It's like free will and fate are talking at two different levels, or about two different kinds of phenomena in the universe. There are periods where we have quite a bit of flexibility, we have quite a bit of choice. There's other areas where we pretty much have next to none, and the only thing we can choose is our response. So what I'm interested in is kind of a realistic balance between the two. Modern astrology has lost its sense of the individual existing within a larger context. We don't each live our isolated lives. There's a larger universe we are part of, and we are constrained by that, but we are also supported by that. So I like a lot of the choice aspect of modern astrology, but it needs to be choice within an overall context. We live in a larger order. We do not have control over that order. And a lot of times the choice that we do have is, how do we respond to it. But even in traditional, like, have you done much with electional?
Yeah.
Tony? Okay. Electional, if you think about it, is a way of saying, okay, I live in a fated and an ordered universe. How can I exercise my free will within that to choose the most auspicious times to do things? If there were no element of free will, then electional astrology would make no sense. And it makes quite a bit of sense.
Right.
So
The sort of metaphor I use for electional to explain it to people is it's as if you were a surfer and you need to pick the right moment to stand up on your surfboard to really capture the wave. And there's a best moment, and that's what we're trying to do, find the best moment to stand up on your surfboard.
Yes.
You can have a good ride.
Yes.
And if we go too soon or too late, you're not going to enjoy the ride.
Exactly. And what I've found in the bit of electional I've done, tell me if this has matched your experience. It's sort of like, this chart wants to choose its time. Let me help choose the time that is most wants.
Oh.
So there's a feeling like when you get the chart, it's right. Okay, that's where it wants to be. It's kind of a, you're coinciding your free choice with sight. As you say, you choose when the wave is there.
Right.
And you ride the wave. Yeah.
But the other thing I found is there's some people who ask me to do electionals, and they seem to have a knack for picking the worst day possible to start something.
Yep.
And then you're sort of stuck like, this is such a bad day astrologically. And
yeah.
But it's really quite amazing. It's I don't know how that happens. But
it's like, if it's got to be this terrible, at least put Saturn in the 12th house. Right. At least put it so.
But then there are other people where things always seem to go well for them. And if you look at the charts, they seem to just naturally pick good times.
Exactly.
Regardless of the astrology. So
yeah. And I sometimes find that I'll call it accidental electional. Where I choose, like, there's a date I don't have control over, and it just happens to fall on this day.
Yeah.
But if I look at the chart for that day, it's perfect.
Yeah.
It describes exactly it. So it's like the universe selects it for me.
Right.
And I have a great deal of trust in that.
Okay. And to get back to the Stoicism, I think Vettius Valens was quite stoical.
Yes.
And he has that, it's his short essay about the meaning of astrology in his life. Do you know that one? It's
I'm not familiar with that one. No.
It's Mark Riley translated it. If you know, he did the translation of the Vettius Valens anthology, but he also translated it's like a little biographical statement by Valens.
Oh, okay. Is it available online? I'll look it up.
It's on Mark Riley's site. Yeah.
Cool. I'll check that out.
And he basically, I'm paraphrasing, if I remember, says, you know, for him, the astrology really is his spiritual practice. He says, it shows me how I relate to the universe, what to expect, and I need to adjust my life to what I see coming.
Perfect.
So that I can, you know, I think your story about modern astrology reminded me when my son was, he's in his 30s now, well, he was a kid in school. There was this big movement in the schools. Kids need self-esteem. So he's like 8 or 9 years old, going to school, and they're trying to build everyone's self-esteem. So one day he does something, I forgot, in the house, which I said, don't do that again. That was really bad. Maybe he was sticking a pencil in an electrical outlet or something crazy like that. And he said, Dad, don't talk to me like that. You're lowering my self-esteem. And that reminds me of some of the extreme modern psychological astrology approach. Like,
yes, exactly.
You know.
Okay, so I think we are kind of trying to find a balance between the fate and free will, and that kind of also establishes that we are pretty much there with both modern and traditional astrology. Again, trying to find a balance. So Ryan Kirkzak, Vedic astrologer from USA, once said that whether you follow fate or free will, as long as your goal is liberation, you're just headed to one final destination, and it doesn't really matter whether you believe in fate or whether you believe in free will. So emanation kind of doesn't leave any one of us. So I think that's what I kind of I don't know if I believe, but I'm being forced to do so of late. So
Well, but if I could say something
sure,
as a
please.
psychiatrist, not as an astrologer, 'cause
Sure.
over the years, I've probably seen thousands of people. It occurs to me, what I've witnessed is that choice is important, that what you choose determines how your life will go. But how you choose is often determined by previous experiences. So, for example, a classic example, a lot of people I saw were abused women. They were abused in childhood, and they grew up, got married to an abusive man. And somehow their choice of a husband or a partner was determined by their earlier experiences. So they had free will in choosing this partner, and then they were surprised that he turned out to be just as abusive as the previous partner. And it wasn't until they could understand how the pattern of their life and their previous choices and their experiences was influencing their current decisions, and then change how they decided, that they could enter a better relationship.
Yep.
So it's kind of that mixture of, there's a lot of determination that we don't have control over. If you're a child and you're being abused at home, that obviously will color your relationships as an adult. And unless you deal with that, so you can make choices more freely, you're going to keep repeating the pattern.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I think you hit on something important there, that kind of a useful metaphor I find for just making sense of this particular existence we happen to be on. There's an educational component. It's a school of sorts.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is, this is not the same as you create your own reality and you see your choices. But it is very much, as you say, we are in situations, and it's sort of like, you're in this situation till you get the point.
Mm-hmm.
That's a case where the modern emphasis on why I'm going through a particular kind of thing that I am is very, very important and very, very useful. That I'm kind of quoting Nietzsche here. Give me a why and I can put up with almost any how.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Without that why, this is meaningless. Why am I going through that? The one other thing I would add, because we're kind of balancing fate and free will over against each other. The more I work with astrology, the more I don't think of the two over and against each other.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
For me, at this point, astrology is not primarily a predictive discipline. When I study astrology, I'm contemplating the order of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
I'm contemplating this wondrous pattern and wholeness and fullness and intelligence that holds the whole things together.
Yeah.
And I will continue to study astrology if I never take another client in my life.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, you could sum it up in, 2 lines out of one of the Psalms. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth forth his handiwork. That's astrology.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I stutter it. And the underlying emotion, I'm tempted to call it, is awe.
Yeah. No, I feel the same.
Yeah.
It just fascinates me that things work out the way they do. And I can't understand it. That's the other part.
Yes.
I keep thinking, if I keep studying, maybe I'll understand it better, but it is awe. Yeah.
Right. And there's an elusive quality to it.
Yeah.
Right when you think you've got it, that's where you're going to get knocked on your butt, right?
Could be, yeah. But another thing that occurred, I think, Ashwin, the first time we talked about this,
Yeah, I know.
I think I gave you the example that Amazon.com
Yes.
has these algorithms, so they know the patterns of how you have purchased things in the past, and they were experimenting with, they could predict in advance what you were about to buy.
Sure.
Using their algorithms, and they were actually planning to mail people items even before they put the order in.
That's scary.
I mean, it's
because they knew you were going to order it before you did.
Yeah, so I have a lot of ads coming up because I always search for Ben Dykes' books, and
Uh-huh.
it kind of whenever I open Facebook, I see images of Ben Dykes' books as Amazon ads. So there is an instinctive or inherent quality of predictiveness in human beings, whether or
Mhm.
not we are astrologers, but we work on past experiences and patterns that we have gone through in
Right.
our lives, which actually makes a very good topic uh, itself for another session where uh, it is important for astrologers to know the actual life of the clients to kind of
Mhm.
understand the pattern and then bring some exact or very valuable predictions which could be useful.
Yeah.
But going back to the Formicus Maternus days, I think that was the period when Christianity started rising, and that was actually also the rise of free will, and Stoicism was probably done and dusted for that particular time. But it is but for some reason we are still reading a lot of Stoic philosophies, and we have not really kind of lost touch with it. And even Stoics, I mean, the Stoicism is really not irrelevant for today's context as well. So, but at the end of the day, a lot of things depends on what a person believes and what a person does not believe. So, do you think various uh, religious customs and other things that happened during that particular time also had an impact in the astrology of those days? Because by the time Christianity rose, we saw a rise of free will slowly, and Christianity kind of banned astrology and started destroying materials on astrology and all those things, which is still a part of history. And if we move into uh, I mean, astrology was still there from 8th to 11th century, but then Islam also kind of banned astrology, citing it as a black magic or something like that. So, and the religious community and those who called themselves very close to God finally did not accept astrology as a tradition, and they considered astrology always puts people, always limits people to a specific thing called fate.
Okay.
So,
Hmm.
yeah.
Okay. Can I address that one for a bit? Because
I
okay,
think both of you can go.
Mhm.
okay. No, what I want to talk about, just to say that Christianity has been, if you will, dismisses or against astrology. That's really an oversimplification.
Yeah.
Like if you go back to the High Middle Ages and the synthesis of Thomas Aquinas,
Yeah.
astrology fits in there like an absolute glove. It's part of the worldview, you know. In fact, you could see also within the Thomistic synthesis, there is an enormous influence of the late Platonists, because that Christian order of the principalities and thrones and dominions and archangels and angels, that's an adaptation of the Neoplatonist order. So there's a fusion there. I think where the conflict, if you will, with astrology came in, not that they didn't recognize that it's part of the world order, but their emphasis is very much on appeal to the will of God, appeal to God alone, and do not appeal to what they would have thought of as lower forces. There's a real kind of a tension and kind of a contradictory quality there. But there are periods in church history where astrology was, an accepted practice. As I understand it, there were popes who consulted astrologers. So it's really not a simple cut and dried kind of a situation. Although it does frustrate me. If the Roman Church accepted astrologers, I would probably be Roman Catholic now. But
Okay.
they'd have nothing to do with me as soon as I walked in the door, and I'm an astrologer first, Anyway, I wanted to make sure we clarify that. It's a very complex relationship. It's not just simple for or against.
Okay.
Anthony, did you have something you wanted to comment on there?
I lost the connection. I think I'm back.
But you're back. Yeah.
I don't know what
Okay.
happened.
Okay.
So I'm
No.
sorry I missed what you said because I was gone for about a minute there.
Just briefly, that there are strong elements of astrology in the Christian tradition. It was not always just one or the other.
You know, I agree with that. Yeah, I've read Thomas Aquinas. It really is integrally astrology. Even before him, the astrological knowledge was passed on in the church, taught in the church.
Yes.
A lot of the great astrologers were monks or priests like Placidus or Regiomontanus.
Yes, yes.
And I guess it was St. Augustine who really
Saint Augustine
came out against astrology, not because he thought it was inaccurate, but because he thought it was less respectful of the deity, I guess.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And part of what I think is going on with that, and this is it's another modern traditional kind of thing, is in the modern world, a lot of modern astrologers, they've really got no worldview to make sense of it. It's sort of this free-floating entity, and it works, and you don't know why it worked, but it's got no explanation. We've lost the sense of astrology being part of an overall integrated worldview.
Sure.
That of course the planets are part of the world order. And of course all of these had meaning. It all makes sense. We've lost that context.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things I think we need now is to rediscover some kind of way of thinking about astrology, as conceptualizing about astrology that is in our modern world, but it makes sense. It's not an anomaly. It's not superstition. It's part of a larger order. I think that's a really important area to be addressed.
Yeah.
It's one I'm very interested in.
Okay, I'm really glad that you said that astrology fits in the religious communities and the other practices very well, because that has been the case in India. If you see, Vedic astrology is a part of the Vedic religion itself, so it is accepted as a daily science by those people who practice the Hinduism as a religion. So it is more of a part of our daily lives here. There are other problems that come because of it, but still astrology is accepted as an actual phenomenon here. So if that is the case in the West, it's really great. So that's and I mean, thanks so much for clarifying that. And that kind of takes us far away in time, like which is close to the 18th and 19th century, when astrology got revived because of Dane Rudhyar and Alan Leo and some of the New Age movement by Madame Blavatsky and people of that particular period, where astrology became esoteric and also really humanistic. If Dane Rudhyar was completely humanistic, I don't know if he's completely humanistic, but I see Dane Rudhyar as a very humanistic astrologer, while others during that period who were associated with the New Age movement were a bit esoteric. And then Carl Jung's views gave a lot of psychological insights, where I mean, 2 or 3 sets of new forms of astrology kind of started to rise. And then in evolutionary astrology also came up with Jeffrey Wolf Green and Stephen Forrest popularizing that particular view of astrology. So we have an amazing history which kind of opens us to various doors which have various forms of astrology. But does every form of astrology fit in very well as a part of blended practice, or how does it form? Because Alice Bailey, Alan Leo, Dane Rudhyar, and Jeffrey Wolf Green, everyone has some kind of difference in how they did astrology. So how do you address that? I mean, anyone can go first.
Well, let me say a little bit more historically, because astrology in the West was taught in universities until the 17th century. It was an essential part of medical school. You couldn't become a doctor without studying astrology.
That makes so much sense.
Yes.
The churches had a lot to do with the universities. Aquinas was a church father and a university professor. And in preparing this talk in Spain, in my research, I came across, it was a very interesting doctoral thesis in which a It was from the University of Salamanca, and the person who wrote the thesis discovered in the National Library of Spain in Madrid a astrology textbook from the 1400s that was used to teach university students astrology at the University of Salamanca. It was I've been trying to get a copy of this thesis. It's out of print, but it was the professor's notes that he taught the course from, handwritten notes that she transcribed and then translated from Old Castilian to modern Spanish.
Wow.
So it's a gem. I wish I could find a copy. But the point I'm making is that this was a university, like Astrology 101 course that you took, taught by a distinguished professor, and it was mandatory learning for the educated people of the time. This is 15th century.
You know, and I think you made a good point there, that this is sometimes something that strikes me when I look at like some of the text that Ben's translating, like from Saul and Abu Mashar and that kind of thing. And part of me thinks that these weren't meant to be standalone. These were, as you know, as you put it, these are teachers' notes. These are something that are designed to be used in a live interchange between a teacher and a pupil. They're not meant to be standalone. Right. So there is something to that of, we're getting the notes, but there's a context behind it that we have to reconstruct.
Right. There was a whole classroom lecture on the notes.
Exactly. I think an awful lot of the earlier astrology texts make sense if you think of them in those terms. That makes sense to you?
Yeah. Oh, in terms of the religion thing, William Lilly called his book Christian Astrology because witchcraft was forbidden. You weren't allowed to do black magic sorts of things. So he wanted to be very clear that he was doing scientific, church-approved astrology, and not this other stuff where you cast spells and, because that was forbidden. Then you could be burned to the stake or things like that, or I don't know what they did in England at the time. Maybe just thrown in jail or fined or something.
And there's also an element in there, and this is in Lilly, and it's very, very strong in Bonatti. Like if you look in the, the 156 considerations, kind of summary of the whole thing, he makes a very, very, and Lilly does this too, makes a very, very distinct process that basically, if you are consulting astrology, this is a serious act. This is a serious event. This is a sacred thing you're doing. And he talks about that should be, prepared by periods of prayer and contemplation and that kind of thing.
Right.
So they integrate the working with astrology in the sense of you are coming before God, you are coming before the divine, and you are asking for guidance.
Yeah.
They put it within an overall sort of context. And I think that context still works. It's when people are coming before the universe and going, this is really important. I need guidance. I need aid. That's when astrology can.
And see, I think that's a problem people have in learning horary, because they ask all kinds of stupid questions.
Right.
Like, what color will my new car be?
Yes.
Who gives a shit? But
Yeah.
they expect to get a valid answer, and when they don't, they think, horary's nonsense. But the point is, the question has to be really important to you.
Sure.
There's no point asking for divine intervention.
And that's the first point I think Bonatti makes in its 146 considerations. There should be a real reason why a person actually approaches an astrologer, and I think he also describes about what kind of steps that the native had taken to kind of get the situation resolved by himself before coming to an astrologer.
Right. He says, don't even ask me if you haven't been searching for an answer for at least a day.
Exactly. It's got to be really, really important. It's a point that I was fortunate to have a all-day workshop from Deb Holding, who I just adore. She is so good.
She's wonderful, yeah.
And a point she made is when you are learning horary, look, don't ask garbage questions.
Yeah.
Only ask real questions, because If you ask garbage questions, you're going to get garbage output, and it will make you doubt the whole process.
Yeah, but the thing is, everybody asks the garbage questions when they're learning.
Oh, yeah.
I think just to appreciate, you might get garbage answers, but you might understand more of the symbolism of the chart.
That's true.
Yeah.
And there's the periods where, like, this one's garbage, and all of a sudden, oh my God, this is a real one.
Yeah.
And you can tell when it's a real one. There's something that sort of clicks into place or something.
Right. The symbolism just fits.
Exactly. That's where it gets eerie.
Yeah.
Sure.
And yeah.
I was saying, in terms of, I was thinking about Lily, and most of us would probably consider Lily traditional, although I guess a Hellenistic person would see him as modern.
Right.
But Lily really combines the psychological and the predictive, I think. And for example, there's one of his charts, a woman, this guy was pursuing her, wanted to marry her, and she was very disdainful, and she dropped him. And then she changes her mind, says, I think I made a mistake, and goes to Lily. And the chart looks like they're not going to get back together, but he takes it, he says, this is what you did wrong. This is what you have to change. This is my advice. And if you really want this, follow this advice. So it's a very psychological approach. He analyzes her behavior, how she treated the guy, how she could do it differently. And he gives her a series of steps to follow to make the situation better. Yeah. So it's a very mixed psychological predictive approach.
Good point. Very good. And I'm betting at the point Lilly thought of himself as state-of-the-art modern.
Yeah.
He was doing the best of what he thought of as scientific astrology.
Yeah. Right.
Okay. So moving on to the techniques. So whole sign house system was the most, dominantly used form of house system in traditional astrology, even though quadrant house systems existed for specific reasons. And there is an interesting story for Placidus, why Placidus became the most dominant house system, because there was tables and rules prepared only for Placidus house systems when astrology was revived in the 19th century. So
I wrote an article about that's not really true.
Okay. Okay.
Charlie's seen the article, yeah.
Yes, I have. And Deb Holding made quite a bit of point with that there's connections. I do not completely understand the math with that, I'll confess, but there are connections between the Placidus house systems and the planetary hours.
Exactly,
So it's not just these happen to be most popular. It's got its own very, very compelling logic.
Yeah.
And there's a reason why it works. But you get the problem again that once you start getting into the northern latitudes, you start getting the grossly distorted housing. And that creates a different set of problems.
But if you want, I can address the Placidus issue very briefly, or
sure.
In Lily's time, in both France with Marinus and Lily in England, they were contemporaries. The popular house system was the Regiomontanus house system. And that had been popular since, I guess, the 15th century when he popularized it. He didn't invent it, I don't think. It had been around for a while. He popularized it. He and his colleagues published tables so that those were the tables that were available. And that was the theory that was accepted as to how houses should be constructed.
Sure.
And it was accepted with the idea that Regiomontanus had read Ptolemy and understood what Ptolemy was talking about how to construct houses. The problem was that Regiomontanus misunderstood Ptolemy.
Okay.
And Placidus did understand Ptolemy. And he was a contemporary of Marinus. He was 17th century also, early 17th century. And he constructed a table of houses based on what appeared to be a more correct understanding of Ptolemy, which was simply that the houses should be based on the rotation of the earth, the rate of rotation of the earth. Whereas Regiomontanus used more of a geometrical model. I'd have to divide the equator into 30-degree segments. Ptolemy said there should be proportional semi-arcs, that meaning that if a planet takes 6 hours to rise, it should spend the first 2 hours in the 12th house, the next 2 hours in the 11th house, the next 2 hours in the 10th house.
Yes.
And that's what Deb is talking about. The planetary hours correspond to the houses.
Yes.
Because you take the path of the planet and you divide it not into space, but into time.
Yes.
Sure.
And this is how Ptolemy was doing his primary directions. He was saying that if a planet rises when it's halfway between the ascendant and midheaven, that corresponds to another planet that rises and is halfway between the ascendant and midheaven.
Uh-huh.
And when they each get to the halfway mark in time, we'll call that a conjunction in primary direction.
Right. So the Placidus house and the primary directions tie together.
Yeah.
Same logic. Makes perfect
Same
sense.
logic.
Yeah.
And Placidus's ideas were so novel that the church banned him. They put him on the index of forbidden books. And people in Catholic countries were not allowed to read Placidus. So what happened was, England was Protestant at that time. They got hold of these texts by Placidus. They said, this is novel, this is remarkable. We've been doing it wrong. Regiomontanus misled us. He didn't really understand Ptolemy, who we could consider our god here. Placidus is doing it right. Suddenly we have enlightenment. So that's the reason they published the Placidus tables. They thought they were the correct understanding of Ptolemy.
Yeah.
And then those became, so in a way it's true that the Placidus tables were available, but they were available for this reason. The British astrologers thought, this is brilliant. This is a novel, brilliant, perfect understanding of how Ptolemy did it. Let's go with the tradition and not with the misunderstanding. And that's why it became popular.
Yeah, you know, and I'm betting part of that was honest. This was a Protestant country, right? It was new and it's novel, and the papists all hate it, so there must be something to it, you know? That it was a deliberate rebellion against the church.
Well, the church condemned Copernicus. You know, how could you say the sun is the center of the solar system? Not in the Bible. And then they thought Placidus was distorting the truth, which had to be Regiomontanus. And
yeah, exactly. Part of me wondered if, like, there was an area of the intellectual life at the time that if you want to check what the current cutting edge is intellectually, check the church's current list of banned books.
I think they got rid of that, didn't they?
I don't know. I really don't know.
It's called the Index of Forbidden Books.
Okay.
Anyway, we took a bit of a segue on you there.
No, I think that's I didn't know about what Anthony was talking about, so it was new. So I didn't know it before. So I think the crux of it here is that we already did a video, Charlie, in terms of how to use both, two house systems, whole sign and the quadrant house systems at one time. And I think Anthony also wrote an article on how both kind of co-work together or coexist with a specific nativity. So, but I don't think many people kind of appreciate that fact, and people always try to label whole sign house system with traditional astrology and quadrant house system, especially Placidus with modern astrology. And even till date, I've been seeing a lot of ugly discussions on public forums, like especially people of, both the groups are very, vocal against the other, and it is very, it's very disheartening to see such stuff. So, but how does a person actually make a shift to a specific house system?
Okay, well, let me go back to I think it's wrong to call the whole sign system a house system. It is not a house system. And if you read the literature, the word they're using in Greek, I think, is topoi, right?
Topoi, yes, place, right?
Which is a place. So what the Greeks were saying, the Hellenistic Greeks, is which sign is in the first place? Which is the first sign? Which sign is in the second place? It's a way of numbering the signs ordinal numbers. It's a system of ordinal numbers.
Mhm.
Which sign comes first? The ascendant. Which sign comes second?
Mhm.
So they're not really houses the way we think of houses as quadrant houses. They're places.
Good way to put it. Yeah.
They're place system. It's a place system.
Good way to put it. Yeah.
Like it's like in a race. Who's in first place? Which runner's in first place? Which runner's in second place?
Mhm.
You don't say which house is the runner in. It's which place is the runner.
Mhm.
It's an ordinal numbering system.
Good point. Yeah.
And the modern adoption of the word house really creates a false impression, I think.
Oh,
Because they're not houses, they're signs. They're signs, and the ascendant sign is the first one, most important.
Yes.
The second sign is the second, it's in second place.
Mhm.
The 12th sign is in 12th place.
Yeah.
They're not houses, they're places. The word house, I think, probably came from the fact that in Latin, the signs were called the domiciles, domicilios of the
Mhm.
planets. And domicile could be translated as house.
Yes. Domus.
But by house there, they mean, or domicile, they mean what planet does the sign rule? Where is the sign at home?
Mhm.
And not what house is it in.
Good point there.
I think, so in the translations, house got confused with places,
yes.
and they're quite different.
Yeah. And there's a point I'd like to touch on this, talking about the different house systems, because part of the reality of the practice of astrology, and this is something that's really, really hard to wrap your head around, is the correct answer in some ways to, well, which house system works is yes. There's people who get really good results from whole sign. There's people who get really good results from Placidus. There's people who use Porphyry. There's people who use Regiomontanus. We are dealing with a system here where multiple methods work, even in a broader sense. Like if I think of, I love the example of like Chris Brennan and Mark Jones are good friends, and they live within totally different astrological universes. Chris is Hellenistic. Mark Jones is modern evolutionary. They've got different toolkits. They've got different sets of meanings. They've got different interpretive techniques. And yet they both come up with valid results. I once did a chart for a friend of mine here in the city using traditional techniques. And I said certain kinds of things about her chart, and she said, you know, this is really interesting because about a month ago, I did a reading with Mark Jones, and he said a lot of the same things.
Yeah.
So part of what we really need to accept here is that part of what's freaky about astrology is that different sets of techniques work.
Yeah.
It's like at any given point, the way I think of it is when a person sits down with an astrologer, the universe is hip enough to use that astrologer's toolkit to give that person the message they need. There is no single set of techniques that we could see. This is right, and that one's wrong. It just plain old doesn't work out that way.
Right.
Amazing.
It is. And it said, what's true about the universe for that to be the case? It's really a freaky thing to wrap your head around, you know?
Yeah, it's just the call of the divination. So
yeah.
Okay, so I think I kind of touched upon almost everything that I really wanted to touch, but so it's, see, at the end of the day, we really don't need to necessarily differentiate the kind of work that we do as traditional or modern. Just kind of go on with the flow and work with whatever you feel kind of you can relate to and suits you well. So
and I'm not sure I would agree with that entirely, because to me, what interests me about traditional is that we use certain ideas in astrology, say modern astrology, and those ideas have a history. They go way back, probably a few thousand years. And I think it's important to understand how the idea originated, what it originally meant, and how it was used, how it's changed over the years, and how we use it today. So we know what we're talking about.
I agree.
House is a good example. When we say house now, we think of like Placidus or one of those systems. If you said house 2,000 years ago, you would think of a sign. the house of a planet. You wouldn't be thinking of a quadrant house.
Right.
Same word, different meaning. And
Yes.
the meaning has changed over the years.
Yeah.
The same with a lot of the, like dignity. I mean, that has changed. Ideas of dignity have changed over the years.
Very much so, yeah.
There's lots of terms in astrology, not the terms bounds, but the terminology in astrology
I know what
that.
you mean.
So, and before we finish, I just want to touch upon this modern rulership scheme. So, what do you think about this modern rulership scheme? Because I almost forgot to address this, because if we don't address this debate would not be complete. So, before we can, I mean, there is no time limitation.
Yeah. If I could talk on that, my sense with that, by the way, I use traditional rulerships. Tony, I think I agree with you on this one, that traditional and modern astrologers are using the word rulership in very different senses.
Yeah.
In the traditional, it means responsibility. It means a planet has a job here. It has something to do. And it's very much in a kind of a overall cosmos. It's, you have a place, you have a role to play within your cosmos, and you're a citizen here. In modern astrology, I think rulership means a lot more like affinity. So like when they think about, like say Neptune as having rulership, they would think, what sign is most like Neptune as to where the ruler goes? It's two different sets of principles. They're doing two very, very different things.
Yeah.
For me, like I said, I do just the traditional rulerships and the way I think of it. And this is even a modern kind of thing. Traditional rulerships, it's a civilization, it's a dignity, it's your place within the civilization metaphor. The outer planets are outsiders. They're aliens. By definition, they don't have a place within the civilization because they come from somewhere else. So in the traditional sense of the term, the modern planets cannot have a rulership.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's my take on it anyway.
Right. So when I started, because what was taught was modern astrology, and so Uranus ruled Aquarius and Pluto, Scorpio, etc. And that's a system I used for many years because it's what I learned. But then as I learned more and more traditional, I ended up adopting the traditional rulerships, still using the modern, quote, modern planets, but more like fixed stars. That's very influential bodies in the sky. But their influence is not because they rule a particular sign, but they have a specific meaning. And when a natal planet conjoins one of those or aspects one of those, it has a specific, like say Mars square Uranus, I'll expect some sort of an accident or injury or disruption. But I'm not viewing Uranus as the ruler of Aquarius.
Yeah.
Although initially I did, and it seemed to work, but I don't anymore. And in fact, there's a very interesting horary. Noel Till wrote a book on horary years and years ago, in which he describes somebody lost something, and he uses just all modern rulerships and gives the person specific directions in their house, like go up the stairs, turn right, walk 3 feet, turn left, and they follow his instructions. They find what they lost. And when I went back over that, I realized he's using all modern rulerships. If we use traditional, it wouldn't work. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, it's freaky.
And I think Ivy Jacobson used modern. Joan McEver certainly did. And it's only after Lily got rediscovered and popularized in the 80s that people began using the more traditional exclusively.
Yes, yes.
Although I think there are some very traditional horary astrologers who will not even put the modern planets in the charts, which I think is a mistake because they often are very revealing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that's sort of
I think I come from that kind of a school where I need some teachings from Antony, because I just learned that Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto ruled specific houses as per modern astrology before like 4 years. Before that, I didn't know that these planets were associated with specific signs as domicile rulers. And I still don't use Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. But I'm just trying to do because I'm reading some evolutionary astrology stuff. So it's I totally agree that it's completely revealing. And yeah, I'm just trying to implement it in my astrological armory.
I could understand that. Yeah, you probably noticed, Ashwin, since you mentioned the article that I did on Plato and Reincarnation.
Yeah, you spoke about evolutionary astrologers.
Right. And did you catch my pun on the title of Jeff Green's book there, right?
Sure, yeah.
I titled the beginning of the article, Plato, the Evolutionary Journey of the Soul.
Exactly. Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think the Republic kind of speaks a lot about what Plato wants to say about some of those philosophies, and not just Republic, but I've not read the complete works of Plato. I have it on my Kindle, and I've been going through a lot of things. But some stuff about Plato are very much in line with what evolutionary astrologers practice today, and the philosophy based upon which Jeffrey Wolf Green has kind of established evolutionary astrologies related to kind of Platonistic philosophy. And I think that's the same with Stephen Forrest as well. But people kind of associated with the New Age movement, and then and New Age, and some people kind of argue that New Age movement has borrowed a lot of things from Eastern philosophy, which I surely don't know the entire answer at this point, which I'll probably find out in some time.
Yeah, and by the way, I want to take this, I'm going to kind of segue back and wrap up with something that you talked about at the very beginning, Tony.
Sure.
Talking about like what Stephen Forrest does. And by the way, I admire him quite a bit. I think he does beautiful work. Stephen Forrest's knack is precisely that of telling the story that makes sense of a person's life. Astrology is all about why. Why am I here? What is the purpose of this? Why I'm doing this? That's why evolutionary astrology is so very, very popular, because it's aimed right at that particular question.
Yeah.
So this is a case where I think that we can learn from Stephen Forrest. We can learn from Jeffrey Wolf Green. They're addressing a hunger there. And we as traditional astrologers would be best served to pay attention to that hunger and to include that dimension in our own work. My work with the Platonic stuff is, if you will, I'm answering Jeffrey Wolf Green's kinds of questions, only I'm looking to traditional astrology and Plato and the late Platonists for my toolkits to do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, if I could just sum up, I'm thinking about Lily's approach to astrology. And I forget exactly, at one point in Christian astrology, he says, he summarizes the literature, everything he's read. He says, this is what this guy says. This is what this guy says. I tried all these things. This is what worked when I tried it. So I kept it. This idea didn't work, so I discarded it.
Yes.
And I think that's a great approach, that there's a lot in the literature. We shouldn't call ourselves modern, traditional, Hellenistic, or whatever. We should, I think, try everything. If we can validate that it works most of the time, keep it. If it seems like crap, just throw it out.
I agree with you. Well put.
Okay, that was I don't know, it was a great brainstorming session for me. And so if you want to talk about some of your future works that you're doing, both of you, it would be great if you can kind of, I think Anthony, you shared some lecture that you're giving for Kepler.
Oh yeah, Kepler College asked me to do a webinar, so I think it's scheduled for August 10th, which is pretty soon, a few weeks from now. It's a Saturday, and it's on anti-science. Just a review of the idea of anti-science in the literature.
Very nice. Yeah. And I guess what I will mention in terms of my things, too, when I recently came out with a book that was a study of working on with the lots of fortune and spirit.
Sure.
And this was very much an example of, I want to take these, I want to see what they refer to. I'm going to do a whole bunch of case studies and talk about what works. And the one other thing I am just now finishing up the first full draft of a book that I am writing on Saturn.
Amazing.
I'm calling it Saturn Through the Ages, Between Time and Eternity. And what I'm doing that I've never ever seen done in a book on the planets, I'm doing a historical survey.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to be reading and commenting on Vetus Valians, Firmicus Maternus, Abu Mashar, Benatti, and then all the way through the transitional astrologers modern and go, this is how Saturn has been viewed through the years.
Mm-hmm.
Let's put this in a historical context. Look at the old meanings, look at what's kept, and then look at how it's changed in the 20th century. What's useful there, what isn't.
And you call Saturn a feminine planet, right?
Actually, at this point, I guess I pursued that line of logic for a while. At this point, I pretty much stay with the tradition. I am including my essays on Saturn as feminine, but I'm putting them in an appendix now.
Okay.
It's really the main source of the main way I view it within that.
Maybe
also,
Saturn is transgender.
Could be, yeah. And also, I am doing my best to reclaim some really, really important parts of the Saturnian experience that our culture tends to want to deny or gloss over. Wonderful and beautiful and valuable things, and I'm not being facetious when I say this, like suffering, old age, mortality, death, decline. We need to recover the importance of these. We need to recover the worth of these as a balance against a extremely progressive, extremely optimistic sorts of society that is now running into gas and is running into a swing back. So that's my latest project.
Okay, wonderful. So I think that brings us towards the end of the show, and thank you so much for joining, and we'll see you next time.
And Ashwin, thank you very much. It was an honor dialoguing with both you gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you, and good luck with your health issues.
Thank you.
Hope you get better soon.
I'll do okay.
Okay.